joined with my colleague, Kirsten Bayer. She is what's your title, Kirsten?
Digital communications manager.
She is our digital communications manager at ICSPS. So she maintains several of our websites. She helps with our marketing, our social media. If you have attended any of the Workforce Wednesday webinars, you have heard her voice, seen her face. She helps facilitate those. And she is also an instructor out at Richland Community College. And so that's kind of the hat that she's wearing today as she's joining us for this community of practice, because she stumbled upon a resource on Illinois WorkNet's website, but there are some amazing resources and tools on there. And so we're trying to bring some light and promote some of those tools. And so this is one that Kirsten actually incorporates into her classroom. And as we are, I keep saying as we're moving into the virtual world, we're in it. We've been in it for a while, but a lot more with AI coming into play, interviewing and ways in which people hold interviews are looking different and changing. And a lot of it is happening virtually, either like this in a Zoom meeting or with AI. You're not actually talking to a real person, you're talking to AI. And it's kind of that organization's way of weeding out individuals who maybe aren't as serious about the job or maybe don't have the proper qualifications, because time is money and people have full plates. And so this is one way that they're doing that. So I'm going to have Kirsten kind of walk us through. Again, Crystal and Amy were very small. So if you have questions, comments throughout, please feel free to unmute yourself, hop on and have those conversations. We are recording, so we will have this available as a resource to our other programs, as well as if you have adult ed, CTE, any of those programs that you think might benefit from seeing this, they're free to watch it as well. So Kirsten, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you. Well, hi. I'm not sure if I met Crystal or Amy, but Crystal, I think I've emailed you a couple times before, maybe about something. But good morning. So like Brittany said, my name is Kirsten Bayer and I'm the digital communications manager at ICSPS. And I have been incorporating this virtual interview assignment in my public speaking classes for the last 3 years, I think. And I've tweaked it each semester based off of like student feedback and what I think has worked well. Illinois WorkNet has also updated the tool. And so I've kind of tweaked the assignment and incorporated some other components of the tool as well, but the bulk or the main component of the assignment has stayed the same. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I was almost going to tell Brittany to go to the next slide, but I'm controlling them. So I don't know why I was going to say that. So like Brittany said, I'm the digital communications manager at ICSPS. I adjunct at Richland Community College in Decatur, Illinois. That is where I reside. And I teach public speaking communications 101, which is the general education course. And then I've also taught in the past a section of business professional speaking. And so when I taught the business professional speaking course in the past, that's how I kind of came up with this assignment. And then I ended up incorporating it into my COM 101 classroom as well, because I saw such a real world application for it. And I thought, even though I'm teaching a general education course, this is such valuable practice for my students. So I wanted to implement it in that as well. I do have a bachelor's and a master's degree from Illinois State University. My bachelor's is in public relations and my master's is in communications. So that is what kind of gives me the qualifications to be able to teach. Also during my master's degree, I had an assistantship, a graduate assistantship, where I taught. And so I taught communications 101 public speaking. I was the sole instructor. I wasn't a TA or anything like that. Like I was the instructor. It was a mentorship program that they have at the School of Communication at Illinois State. And they did, like, there wasn't a professor or a tenure professor or anything. I was the sole instructor. I watched my mentors class, I watched them teach, and then I went and taught my section for the first semester. And then after that, I continued teaching solely. They put us through like a 10-week how to be a college instructor boot camp. So how to be a teacher boot camp program. And so I went through that as well. So I've been teaching communications 101 public speaking for since 2018. So that's like what, 5 years? I can't do math very well. And I only have taught business professional speaking one time, but it's a similar course as well, just more real world practice. So today's agenda, I'm going to talk about why I felt there was a need for this assignment for my students. So it kind of an introduction to virtual interviewing. And then I'm going to talk about the workNet tool. It's called the Illinois workNet interview prep tool. And then the assignment that I actually give my students and like tips that I give them. And so you can feel free to take this to your classroom. I'm happy to send anything to you guys that I use. And you can feel free to use the exact same assignment or tweak it, whatever you feel is relevant for you and your colleagues in your departments. So how I kind of came up with this is because when I was applying for full-time positions prior to getting my job at ICSPS, and I was just graduating graduate school, I was introduced to virtual interviewing, and this was before the pandemic. So I was applying for a lot of jobs at big corporations like State Farm, Country Financial, ADM, which is here in Decatur, Caterpillar. And so those big corporations were doing virtual interviewing already prior to the pandemic, and they were using basically a LMS system with a form of artificial intelligence to implement their initial interview. So they had pretty much done away with phone interviews, like phone interviews were non-existent. So virtual interviews are here to stay. And are they? The answer is yes, they are. So in my research, I found a couple different surveys and studies, and this was actually prior and then during the beginning of the pandemic. So 1,100 US employers were surveyed, and 82% said that they adopted virtual interviews for candidates because of the pandemic. So bigger corporations were already doing it beforehand, but obviously we all had to adapt during the pandemic. And then 93% of those surveyed expect to continue to use virtual interviews in the future. So this is them talking about continuing it after the pandemic has dissipated a little bit, which that's the time period that we're currently in. And we have not seen them go anywhere. They are still very relevant. So another research survey that I found was that 61% of surveyed recruiters, so these are recruiters trying to recruit people to come work for their corporations or their businesses, specifically looking at our students. Our recruiters are hot and heavy on our students who are just graduating from their programs and things like that. So 61% of recruiters said that the hiring process will be a combination of virtual and in-person going forward. So we're seeing not only hybrid in our workplace environments, but now we're seeing hybrid in the virtual or the interview process as well. And not only big companies and big institutions are implementing this, also small CBOs, community-based organizations, and small places of business are also implementing this as well, because we've seen such an accessibility influx of programs like Zoom. I mean, prior to the pandemic, not a lot of people knew how to use Zoom unless you worked in a corporate world where you were dealing with people who were across the state, across the country. Now, a small mom and pop business owner can get access to Zoom for pretty affordable, and they have the access to use it as well. So virtual interviewing is definitely not going anywhere because, like Brittany kind of mentioned at the beginning, it's such a money saver, and we're going to talk about that as well. So these mom and pop places are also utilizing that. It's a smart business practice, and it's becoming one of their best practices. 22% said that they plan to conduct all virtual hiring. So again, these surveys were researched, and I found them. These were businesses and employers and recruiters that were surveyed at the beginning of the pandemic, right when they were starting to adopt these practices. So there's two types of virtual interviewing, which a lot of people aren't aware of. And so this is the content that I teach my students, is that there are two types of virtual interviews that they might come in contact with when they are starting to interview for full-time positions. There are live video interviews, or what we call two-way live. So live video interviews are two-way live, and these are used as a replacement for in-person interviews in a remote environment. So interviewers or employers use video conferencing tools. So very similar to, I would get on a Zoom with Brittany and I'm the employer interviewing her, but we're just doing it through Zoom. So it would be the same structure, same type of questions and things like that as a real in-person interview or even a phone interview, but we're just using Zoom, a video conferencing platform, WebEx, Google Meet, whatever, to do the actual meeting. So we're all very familiar with this kind of component of meeting virtually now. So same thing, just doing an interview over it. So that's called a two-way live interview. And then there are one-way interviews. This is typically used earlier in the hiring process as a preliminary screening interview, and it's not meant to replace face-to-face live interactions. So this is what I was running into when I was applying for full-time positions prior to me getting my position here at ICSPS. I was running into these one-way interviews. So these big companies were using LMS systems and AI to like a preliminary screening interview in place of a phone interview. So I would have a one-way interview, and then I would have go into an in-person interview. So instead of having a phone interview, then an in-person interview, it was a one-way interview, then an in-person interview. So kind of a different process to interviewing for full-time positions. So I know there's only a couple of us, so we can actually just talk if we want to. We don't have to do the poll, Brittany. But have any of you ever done a live video interview or two-way virtual interview? So have any of you ever done an interview over Zoom or something like that? Brittany has, Angel has, okay. Yeah, so I mean, we've all done Zoom meetings, right? But like specifically an interview, because it is a different experience. But do you feel like when you were doing those interviews, was it more or less difficult than actually a face-to-face going into an office setting interview? And why was it more or less difficult?
So mine was more difficult for me because the entire thing was being done on Teams, and I was not familiar with Teams at that point. I had never used it in my life, and I had to do a presentation as part of the interview. And I was like, okay, well, if I need to click a button, you guys are gonna have to tell me because I haven't used this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was more difficult just because I was on a platform I was not familiar with.
Right. Okay. Brittany, did you want to, or Crystal?
So I did a few different job interviews. I also did interviewing for like news stations and things like that. But overall, I think it's more difficult because it's harder to read body language. I had done one interview on a day my daughter ended up being sick, and they said it was fine, and I'm trying to multitask and things like that. And I think even the person interviewing you, you don't know what they're also reading on the screen, who's coming into their office, what kind of mindset they're in when you're in person. You're usually in a room with the people interviewing you. You can see them. It's a focused time. So I do think it is very different.
Yeah. Anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I've actually been on both sides. So I've been the interviewee and I've been the interviewer. When I was the one being interviewed, it was actually before the pandemic. And so my comfortability level with Zoom and virtual platforms was fairly non-existent at that point. And so that just created like more nerves, more anxiety, because, like, okay, well, what are they going to ask me to do? And like, if I hit the wrong button, and then interviewing someone virtually, as Crystal said, like the body language, you can't, I'm a big on body language, and I talk with my hands. Like, you can't see it. Sometimes I try and put them up here, but I talk with my hands, and there's certain things, and even like, minute facial expressions, you can't really pick up when you're doing interviews virtually, and that makes a difference. If someone kind of flinches at a question, or there's just that personal level that's really lost when you're doing them virtually.
Yeah. And what I was finding was that it was, when I was doing it and going through it, it was really hard as the interviewee to convey that enthusiasm and excitement for the position because of that component of only being able to see from here up. So yes, I was running into the same things when I was going through those experiences. So when I was reflecting back on my personal experience, I was like, my students are going to go through the same things as well and experiencing the same things as well. But what I was thinking about when I was reflecting is that, okay, my students maybe aren't going to deal with as many issues as like what Angela experienced, because they are from a generation that is so heavily tech savvy, and they have lived now, current time, through the pandemic, where they've been forced to do some sort of schooling, whether that was in high school or if they were in college classes then online, right? But I was reflecting and I was thinking, my students, there's a difference between a student being tech savvy and being able to get on a Zoom call and attend a class, and being able to get on a Zoom and portray themselves as a professional and show that enthusiasm for the position and that they want to be hired. There is a difference. I mean, I don't know if any of you taught virtually during the pandemic, but I did teach virtually during the pandemic, and I teach public speaking. So to get my students to do a public speech via Zoom was a real conundrum, honestly. Most of them, it was like, I had to basically force them, but I couldn't force them to turn their cameras on during a public speech. I couldn't force them to do that, right? Because of accessibility and privacy reasons. But without that, it wasn't really a full assignment. So I was running into those issues, and I was like, my students, yes, they might have the technology skills to actually get on a video conferencing platform, but do they actually have the interview skills to be able to convey themselves as a professional in their field of choice that wants to be hired? That's a different kind of skill set, and to be able to do that virtually as well, because like we've talked about, there are many barriers, but there are also a lot of pluses and benefits to doing the two-way virtual interviewing. And we're going to keep talking about those. So the next discussion question that I have is, have any of you ever done a one-way virtual interview? So remember, we defined one-way virtual interviewing as you actually are logging onto some sort of LMS system or AI system, and they are recording your answers, but you are not talking to a physical person. There's no physical person on the other side of the video that you're using. So that's what I was running into when I was interviewing the one-way interviews at these big corporations. I would log on to a system, I'd make a username and a password, and they would record me. There would be a question and I would get recorded, but I wasn't talking to anyone. So have any of you ever done an experience like that for a virtual interview? No. So most people haven't.
Oh, I did. And I actually had one that was over the phone years before COVID, that you got sent a number that you called, and it was basically someone's like voicemail, and it would say like, please state your name. You stated your name, please. It would ask a question and you would answer it, and then it's like hit pound something when you were done, and it just submitted your answers. But I did have to do one where I logged in and they had to be able to record you, and I just pretended I was talking to a person because it was weird.
Yeah, it's uncomfortable, right? I've never heard of the phone one that you experienced. I feel like now, like post-pandemic, nobody's really probably doing that because they can do the video where they can see the person. But that's interesting. I've never heard of the phone one before, but yeah, similar experience. I'm sure it was still uncomfortable talking on the phone to no one. But we've been exposed to that a little bit during voicemails, I guess. I'm sure it was still weird, but yeah, video, like talking to yourself, especially videoing, and you can see yourself and you're just staring at every blemish, right? Is super uncomfortable. And so that's kind of the experience that I wanted to introduce my students to, because I don't see virtual interviewing going anywhere. I only see it getting bigger and more accessible to fields that like my students are going into, because a lot of my students, since I'm teaching at a community college, yes, they might be going on to pursue a 4-year university, but many of them are going to just pursue their 2-year degree or a certificate or something like that, especially my students who take my business professional speaking class. That class is not easily transferable to a 4-year university. So my students who were taking that course were taking it for accreditation towards their certificates. A lot of my students were in welding programs, HVAC programs, electrician programs, or like just RN, not wanting to pursue a BSN. So I wanted to expose my students to this type of interviewing because I see those fields growing more towards this pathway and this process, because it is saving them time and money to be able to weed out those candidates. So there are some benefits for the employer and the employee to virtual interviewing. So for both the employer and the employee, it does create more accessibility. So we obviously have learned this from the pandemic. There's more accessibility when we're able to do things remotely at home. If somebody is disabled, they're not able to get around as well. Or if somebody, you know, like Crystal had a sick kid at home, that accessibility allowed her to be able to still do her interview. There is a shorter time to hire for the employer. So from the start of actually screening an applicant, and when you're looking at the HR process, from the start of screening an applicant through the time of actually hiring them and them accepting an offer, used to be an extremely long window, right? Because think about all the execution time. You had to screen the applicant, you had to, call the applicant, do a phone interview, schedule an in-person interview. Some companies do more than just 2 interviews. They do 3 interviews, like maybe they have an interview with a C-suite or something like that. And then they have to offer them the job, fill out all the paperwork, the training. I mean, to hire a new person and get them fully trained sometimes is at least a 3-month to 6 months, sometimes even a year process. So but the benefit to virtual interviewing is it kind of streamlines the beginning of that process, because they are able to weed out candidates quicker. They don't have to organize timing and scheduling, right? Because you have to find a time for the interviewee and the interviewers to meet up and actually conduct the interview. So you're saving that time component as well. So it's a shorter time to hire, and time is money, like we've talked about. So from the employer side, that's a benefit. It's more streamlined hiring process. And so what I mean by that is that when you do virtual interviewing, it doesn't allow for that social interaction, but with the elimination of that social interaction piece, it does create a more streamlined hiring process, because employers are asking the same questions in a row to the same candidates. So it creates a more streamlined process, which is better for equity and inclusion as well. And it also does create a better candidate experience for some applicants. Some don't like it, some want that social interaction, but some do, because they have more control over when and where they interview. So it kind of eliminates some of that communication apprehension or the natural nerves that we all experience when we're going into a public speaking event. And interviewing is a public speaking event that we all face in real life. And so we all have some sort of level of communication apprehension, that adrenaline rush, right? We get a little nervous, especially if we're trying to impress people, which is basically what an interview is. And so as the interviewee, it's a benefit. Can you still hear me? Oh, okay. I think I froze a little bit, but as an interviewee, it's a benefit because you are able to control when and where you interview. You can interview from home. You can wear your pajama bottoms, right? Because they can only see you from here up. You can have like sticky notes on your computer for things that you want to make sure you do and remember. I remember when I was doing my one-way interviews, I had a big fat sticky note on my computer that said like, make eye contact with the camera, right? Because that's hard to do. You always want to look at yourself. So benefits to one-way virtual interviewing. So again, this is where they're recording the candidate, is that it standardizes the preliminary interview process. It boosts hiring collaboration. So more people who are on the team of the employer can watch the interviewee and their questions. If I'm on Amy's team and we're interviewing a new candidate, I can watch their one-way video recording of their virtual interview at 10 o'clock at night after I've put my kids to bed. And that's when I have the time, right? But Amy, my boss, can watch it at 10 a.m. when she has time the next workday. So it creates for this like more hiring collaboration on the employer's side, and hiring managers can provide input earlier on. It was what we have seen in research that results in better hiring outcomes. So you're getting a better quality candidate because you are able to weed out, the employers are able to weed out the people who aren't qualified, like Brittany was talking about. Employers can interview more people, right? Time is money. And so if we can create a more streamlined process, employers can, then they're able to interview more people, which is actually good for the candidate because it's giving candidates who might not quite reach the qualifications, but maybe they are the best person for the job. And typically we wouldn't have interviewed them in the past because we just don't have the time, right? Now, because the employer has created a more streamlined process, they now have the time to interview those people who are just under the threshold for qualifications. And then they might end up being the best person for the job. So employers can interview more people, and this gives candidates more opportunities to apply for jobs that they might not be quite qualified for, but they feel like, I'm up to take on that challenge. The decision on whether a candidate advances also isn't solely dependent on one person, because you can send out a one-way virtual interview recording to everybody on your team, right? So it kind of helps reduce bias as well. So that's kind of my research, my information that I found, that I was like, I want to expose my students to this environment because who else is exposing them to it, right? And I remember the first time I was exposed to it was the first time I was interviewing for a full-time position, and I was extremely nervous. It was extremely uncomfortable, which you all can attest to as well. And it was just awkward, right? So I wanted to expose them to this. So I don't even remember, honestly, how I stumbled upon this tool on Illinois WorkNet. I think I was just messing around on there and looking at stuff. And I came across this tool and I was like, wow, this is really great and very intuitive. And they've actually updated it since I started using it. I started using it in 2020 during the pandemic. So they've updated it 3 years later now. So it's an interview prep tool, and anybody can get on there in the state of Illinois, not just students, but anyone. But I use it for my students, can practice for interviews. And so it's actually really good practice, even if you have an in-person interview, if your student has an in-person interview as well, it's great practice for that. So there's new features that allow students and people who use this tool, anybody in the state of Illinois can use it for free, can browse through over 1,000 types of interviews. And they can record their responses to interview questions. They can customize and create their own interview, which is kind of nice, and choose from over 12,000 questions. So like, for example, my husband actually has been recently interviewing for fire departments, and he went to a I forget what it was called, orientation session for a fire department, and they gave him a list of questions that would potentially be asked in the interview. And so what we did is we went on the prep tool and we created and customized our own interview for him, and we typed in the questions, and then he was like, that he got already that he knew was going to be asked, and then he was able to record his responses and kind of practice his answers. And then when he was watching his recordings back, he could really tell. He said, he was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how many times I say He's like, I say like we counted. He said in one answer like 18 times. And so just being able to practice those types of things. And then practicing an interview in advance will get students thinking about how best to answer those questions that they may be asked. And so this tool is really great. I love it. I use it or like I used it for my husband even, but I use it for my students every semester as well. It's free to use and access with an Illinois WorkNet account. So my students do have to make an account. I disclaimer that to them. If they are uncomfortable making a username and password account, then I do have an alternative assignment for them, but I've never had a student deny making a username and password. I feel like everything nowadays uses a username and password, so they're pretty much just accustomed to it. So they log into Illinois WorkNet. You click on the resumes button in the banner, and then you select take a practice interview, and then you can browse through over 1,000 interviews available, or you can create your own interview from over 12,000 available questions, or you can even type your own questions in, which is what me and my husband did for his firefighter interviews. So some tech tips that I go over with my students are all of these. So I I explain the assignment to them. I actually have a video recording where I walk them through the assignment and walk them through the tool, the directions of the assignment, my expectations. I feel like since this is such a fluid assignment, it was easier for me to make a video of me giving the directions than to write it all out for them, right? And also I've learned that my students aren't very good at reading very long, lengthy, specific directions, but they will watch a 3-minute video. So I actually created a video for all the directions. And so these are some tech tips that I go over with my students when they're preparing for their virtual interview assignment. Make sure your microphone and your webcam work properly. I do require them to have that. I have a way for them to complete the assignment on campus as well. If they do not have access to a microphone and webcam, I don't expect them to go out and buy one. And I tell them that it is on my syllabus that they'll need one, but they don't. It's not required for them to go buy one because Richland has provided me just like a small room that has a computer that has a microphone and webcam. And I've had students go in there to complete the assignment before too. We just kind of schedule a time where they can go in and complete the assignment, and they do that. Prior to the interview, if the customer knows whether it will be on Zoom, Teams, or another platform, they should check and make sure their audio and video works in that platform as well. So I tell my students this, right, for their future use. Students may find that their computer needs updates. So I make sure that, to tell them to check their updates of their installation. I make sure that they're comfortable using webinar or the meeting platform. So I make sure that they practice on this platform for Illinois WorkNet. And they can also, like, if they mess up or something, they can re-record it. And then to make sure that they know how to easily use their microphone and their webcam. Most of my students are good at that at this point prior to the pandemic as well. So basically what the virtual interview assignment is that I've created is step one is I actually have them watch this webinar that we did for a Workforce Wednesday webinar. I'm kind of morphing my two positions with that. So I have my students watch this standing out in a virtual interview webinar. I just started having them watch this past spring, actually. So this was my first semester because we recorded this as a Workforce Wednesday webinar. We did this in collaboration with Illinois WorkNet. So I worked with David Garvey from Illinois WorkNet and also National Able Network, Jumpstart Your Career. They were on this webinar as well. So I actually have my students watch this webinar as a part of their assignment. It's like an hour and a half. So they do this in place of lecture for that week. And then I have them watch my video that I've created with the directions for the assignment, and I walk them through the tool and how they log in and how they access it and what my expectations are and all of that. So basically the assignment is for them to watch 2 videos and then to complete the assignment, the video that the direction video tells them to do. So I've just linked this here so that way when we share the slides out, it's easily accessible, but we're not going to watch it. And then I also give my students this virtual interview success checklist as well, just for them to, a good checklist for them to go back to when they do experience a real world virtual interview as well, but then they can use it for the assignment too. So that's kind of one of the checklists that I give them. So now I'm just going to demonstrate the actual tool itself and what I use for my students. And then I'm actually going to show you one of my students and their assignment that they submitted. So let me share this here. Yes. Okay. Are you seeing the web browser?
Yep.
Okay. So, let me get all my little windows here situated. Okay, so the first thing that I have my students do, and this is basically what I tell them in the directional video, like exactly what I'm going to walk you through all right now. Basically, what I have my students do is I have them log on to LNA WorkNet, give them the link, right? I have them log in. So I think I'm actually logged in right now. So let me sign out. So there we go. Okay, so they go to LNA WorkNet's home. I walk them through how to log in. So they would click sign up. They would fill out all their information, right? Blah, blah, blah. They create an email and a password and all of that. So I walk them through the directions of that. And then they can use this forever. And I make sure to tell them that as well. They can use this for as long as it exists. So when they're applying for full-time jobs, even if it's 2 years later, they will still have this account. So I make sure to let them know that, like write down your username and your password. It's a great tool. And so they can go back to it and sign in. Oh, why is it doing that? Uh-oh. Maybe because I'm signed in on this. One second, technical difficulties. Okay, so they would go to LNA WorkNet, they would sign in. Okay, yeah, so they click log in, I'm signed in now. They would click to resumes, and then it redirects them to the skills first, basically an LMS system that WorkNet uses. So this is really cool because my students can also use this to help them create a cover letter. They can practice creating a pitch. They can practice creating a portfolio. They can watch career advice videos. They can take a short career assessment. So I actually implemented that, taking a career assessment into my business professional speaking class that I taught in the past. And so they kind of took a career assessment to help them kind of figure out, what it is, what kind of career path that they might be interested in. So they provide help creating a resume as well. I think this is a really just great things to expose my students to, that they realize that these tools are out there to help them, because I've found that a lot of my students who take my class have never created a resume before, or if they have, it's maybe not to the standard that they would want it to be when they are applying for full-time jobs. So just to know that, there's a tool out there that's geared specifically towards helping you create a resume, create a cover letter, take a practice interview. And my students don't just have to resort to Googling, how do you make an interview, right? Where they're going to find some random resource that may or may not provide them good advice. This is geared towards that. And then they also have using AI, use ChatGPT, and they have a how to start practical guidance. There's so many tools and everything on here, and then it saves everything for you. So like when you make a resume, it has 2 on here. When you practice interviews, it has 14 on here. It'll save your questions, your answers, your files, any pitches that you make. So it's kind of your own little portfolio for interviewing for jobs, which is great for my students, especially when they're interviewing for multiple positions in the future. So what they do for my assignment is they click take a practice interview. And then they can browse from so many interviews. So say I have a student who wants to be a nurse. they can type in nurse and they can take, there's specific nurse interviews, like if they want to be a nurse anesthetist, if they want to be a midwife, if they want to be a nurse practitioner. There's so many different ones, just like a registered nurse interview. So the questions are geared towards that position, which I think is really nice. If I have a student who wants to be a teacher, they can do, they also have that as well for secondary education, for art and drama, music teachers. If I have a student who wants to be a welder, they can do that as well. There's a interview for that specifically. So what I have my students take for the assignment is just behavioral interview 1. Which is the very first interview that pops up. And the reason I do this is because it's basic interview questions. Because again, my point for this assignment is just to expose them to this tool and expose them to being able to this environment, convey themselves through this virtual one-way way of interviewing that they might come into contact with in the future in the real world, so to speak. So I just have them do behavioral interview 1 for the actual assignment, and it just asks them basic general interview questions. But what I like about it is that it does include scenario questions, which a lot of interviewers are starting to do. Tell me about a time when you solved a problem. Tell me about a time when you had a bad customer experience and you had to solve it, right? So those scenario based questions. And so I want to expose my students to those. So the first question is briefly, tell me about yourself. So basically that elevator pitch. And so what I have my students do is they can actually watch this video.
Briefly, tell me about yourself.
Where it just asks them the question live if they want to. And then they can obviously read the question. They can actually write notes on here. So if they wanted to like type out their answers to help them do notes, they can write notes right here and save it. So when they're ready to start recording, they click start interview, and then they click add an answer. And then they would click record audio video. So again, I walk them through all of this during the directions, and then they click record video. And then you can see it's popped up here. What I also like about this system is that it gives you 2 minutes exactly, which 2 minutes is the prime time that you want to answer a question in. If you research anything about interviewing, you never want to be, as the interviewee, you never want to be answering a question and talking for more than 2 minutes. You will lose the employer completely. So whatever the answer is to the question, you want to be able to execute it concisely within 2 minutes. If you're talking for more than 2 minutes, you will lose the employer. So I like that as well. And that's something that I grade my students on, is if they're able to convey their full answer within the 2 minutes, and they have a timer here that actually times them, which is great for them as well. So like if I clicked record, it would be recording me right now as I'm talking. I can see the timer. I can see myself answering the question. I'm briefly telling you about myself, blah, blah, blah. And then whenever I'm done answering the question, I can click stop. It would upload it. And then I click save media, and then done. And my answer is now saved. It takes about a minute to convert, but I can go to the next question. The next question, can you give an example of your problem solving ability? Again, I would walk through the same process. So the whole assignment that I have my students do is all 10 questions of this behavioral interview 1. So there's multiple questions. Give an example of an obstacle or major problem that you had to overcome in your career. What is the best job you've ever had and why? Who is your role model? So I think these are all good questions for my students to start reflecting on, because these are similar potentially to future questions that they would be asked in a real world interview. And again, they save their answers when they're recording. Another thing that I like is that if they mess up, they can re-record, and there's no amount of times that they're limited to re-recording, which I like for them. It kind of helps ease that communication apprehension that they have. They know they can redo it if they mess up, and it kind of forces them to practice more and more and more, because if they mess up, then they redo it. If they mess up, then they redo it, right? So I'm just exposing them to the process and getting comfortable talking in front of a camera, talking to themselves. Things that I grade them on are things like eye contact, if they use body language in the camera, right? Like me talking with my hands, Brittany said that, but that's that's something that they want to be sure that they're conveying. Can I hear them, right? Is their volume good? Is their rate good, the rate at which they're speaking? Are they remaining eye contact with the camera, or are they looking down, right? I can tell those things when I'm watching the videos back. And I'm going to show you actually what that looks like. So when my students are ready to submit the assignment, they simply, go to the share button. And it's kind of like you're sharing a Google Doc, actually. So share interview answers with a viewer. So they want me to be able to only view their answers, right? And then permissions with anybody with the link. And I walk them through how to do that. And I click copy link, and then I click share. And then my students simply paste the link into Canvas, which is what we use for Richland here. This is my Canvas classroom. And so I have them watch the video, and then I have them watch the direction video with the Illinois WorkNet website. And then when they submit the video, it looks like this with the link here. So they literally just submit the URL, and then I'm able to click on that URL and watch their videos back. So I did ask this student if I could share his assignment. And so this is his answer. So this is what I'm grading. This is his answer to the first question.
My name is Jordan Davis. I'm a maintenance tech in our turbocharger assembly plant. I've been at our facility for a little over 2 years, and I've been in maintenance for over a decade. I have led multiple teams and projects to completion with minimal delays and excellent results.
Okay, so as you can see, like, this is what I'm grading and what I'm able to watch back, and this is what they're able to practice. And all 10 of his questions are here. So that is what I have my students do for the assignment. And it's a great public speaking assignment, but I also think it's good for any other kind of classroom as well. And you could even have them take specific interviews that are more specific to the subject that you're teaching. But I just like to have them do the first one, because what I'm teaching them is public speaking skills. So that is the assignment in a nutshell. We have about like 9 minutes roughly for any kind of questions, or if you have any questions, you can always email me as well. But that is the interview prep assignment, and you can use it for other things too. I have had my students make like a fake, like a pretend resume on there as well for one of my assignments too. So I think it's just a cool tool to implement into your classrooms. Did anybody on this call know of this tool before we were introduced to it today?
I've heard you talk about it, but I haven't actually seen it.
It's pretty intuitive, which is nice, and I like it.
I didn't realize how much more involved it was and customizable. It's great.
Yeah. Like I said, I just have my students do the basic behavioral one because I want to expose them just to the system. But I think, if you're teaching a subject specific class, there probably is an interview on there for it, or you could even create your own and have your students, like, you could create your own questions and then have your students do that one, which I think is really nice. Anybody have any questions or comments or anything? No? Okay. Well, if you do, or if you have somebody like maybe a colleague or someone on your team that wants to implement this and they have questions, or they want my rubric or something like that, I'm happy to share that information. And any pointers and stuff, or any kind of problems that my students have run into. I do have students who run into tech problems, right? So I reiterate time and time again, make sure you test it out, make sure you can log in and all that. So that way they are able to access. But every semester that I do it, I have less and less technology issues, which is nice. I don't know if my students are just getting more tech savvy or if I'm just getting better at explaining the assignment, probably both. But yeah, my students seem to like it. And I think it's an actual assignment that's applicable and not just something I'm having them do for a grade. So
So Kirsten, do you have the direct link as to where you can find this on Illinois WorkNet?
Yeah, so you literally just go to Illinois WorkNet main page, and then you click on resumes.
Okay.
Yeah, so you just go to their main homepage, and you do have to log in, like you do have to make an account, and then you just click on resumes, and then it pulls you up into it.
Which in making an account on Illinois WorkNet, that's free. So that's
Yes.
always one of the questions we get, but yes, it is a free resource. All right. Well, if there aren't any questions, Kirsten, thank you so much. Like I said, I know Illinois WorkNet has some amazing resources, but it's nice to kind of know where they are and how to find them and then see them being utilized. And so I will share out this recording. I imagine Kirsten will be okay with me sharing her slides. And then if you all utilize this or have any questions, you can always feel free to get a hold of her. And if you think, maybe you have your CTE adult ed partners who might find this beneficial, you can always share these resources with them as well.